Hi, my name's William Macalpine, and I'm here today to talk to you about the role for bioenergy crops, perennial bioenergy crops on farm. I've mainly worked on short rotation coppice willow, pictured here in our research plots. I've been concentrating on breeding new varieties that are pest and disease resistant and high yielding. I've been doing this at Rothamsted Research for the last 18 years. So the idea of growing energy on farm isn't particularly new. Before the Industrial Revolution, around 30% of the farm was dedicated to growing energy, whether that was oats for draft animals or coppice products for construction or woodland. So it's not a completely new idea. And at the moment, these bioenergy crops are deployed on farm and are growing in the UK at the moment. Here's a picture of a field in Cumbria that's about 3 years old. This picture was taken in October, so just before senescence. And there are around 10,000 hectares of these crops being grown at the moment. So it's not a huge area, but it's something that is out there at the moment, and it's not a completely new idea. So I wanted to talk about the previous supports and considerations when choosing perennial bioenergy crops, and also some opportunities in this area. So in the past, in the late 90s and early 2000s, there was an establishment grant for establishing, paid for about half of the costs of establishing these crops. This was administered by the Forestry Commission. Then in the early 2000s, this switched to the Energy Crop Scheme that was administered by Natural England, and this ended in 2013. Since then, there's been a kind of different support for biomass, and this has been through the Renewable Heat Incentive, or the RHI. Not quite sure on the future of this, I'll talk about that in a moment, but this was a real switch from a kind of front end paying for half of the establishment costs to actually bringing woody biomass through by kind of funding the end use. And this has led to a lot of biomass boilers being deployed on farm and across the country. And I'd say right now, the biggest opportunity for cultivating these bioenergy crops is if you've got a biomass boiler and for considering self-supply. A lot of the choice around choosing which crop to go for depends on your end market, whether that's self-supply or for different end uses. But you really need to match the crop with the specifications needed by your end use. So if you've got your own boiler, you want to be looking at the chip size, the moisture content, and all those factors so you can choose the end crop. This will not only affect the crop choice, but also your method of harvest. So you really need to consider these things. Another consideration is the long-term nature of these crops. The reason why they're of interest is because they are really sustainable, and you plant them and they've got the perennial nature, so you get repeated harvests from them, and that's how they capture and sequester the carbon, which is fantastic. But to make them work, they need to be there for quite a long time, so you can get the repeated harvest cycles and kind of benefit from that investment in the establishment. So Energy Crops consultant Kevin Lindegaard from Crops for Energy, he likened the choice here about those big lifetime decisions like getting married or choosing a mortgage. You really need to consider this properly and make the right choice, and even get expert advice when looking into this. And there are going to be big opportunities in this area coming up soon. These crops aren't specifically named yet in ELMS or the new agricultural support, but they are very well placed to deliver lots of the objectives of the government's 25-year environment plan. So from clean water, clean air, net zero, biodiversity, they're very positive crops, and they align well with those strategies. And as well as simply earning money for biomass produced, there's going to be an opportunity to gain income from these emerging carbon trading or carbon offsetting markets. These are emerging, so they're not mature yet, but it's a potentially really interesting income stream to consider. So it's good to look at government policy in this place as well. I talked a second ago about the grants and the schemes that were available, but one thing's for certain: bioenergy is well placed to help deliver the government's net zero strategy, and it's going to have a really important role, and there's potential for domestically grown biomass. In 2012, when DEC, the Department for Energy and Climate Change, was the government organisation involved in delivering this, there was rightly concern about land use choice, land use change implications, and it's really important to kind of think that this isn't going to be the silver bullet that delivers all of our net zero piece, but if it's deployed appropriately and doesn't compete with food, it can be a really important part of the mix. The Committee for Climate Change that advises the government in these matters has produced some really good reports, and the text on the left talks about their kind of latest thoughts in this area, and you can see that the importance of woodland being deployed on farms, but they are talking about 260,000 hectares of farmland shifting towards producing energy crops. So these perennial energy crops have got a big role in addition to the woodland that's kind of been really politicised. Everyone's heard about planting targets, but these perennial bioenergy energy crops have a role as well. So there's lots of thought going on in this space, and I think we're going to learn a lot more soon. But there's lots of honourable mentions for bioenergy crops, and the role and the risks are kind of well known and very well considered. So I wanted to flag up, while self-supply and using wood and biomass products locally is really great, especially where it's displacing oil use and you're not on the gas grid. It's a fantastic choice that will stack up economically. Lots of the government policy that is driving this is combining these perennial energy crops with carbon capture and storage technologies, or BECS, bioenergy carbon capture and storage. And this combination of these crops with this kind of end use is one of the important components of the model that allows us to reach net zero by 2050. And there are various kind of models. There's a headwind, a tailwind, and a kind of medium model, and these see between 10, 30 or 60,000 hectares of energy crops being planted annually every year by 2034 to kind of get these much larger areas. And just to put this in context, at the moment there's only around 10,000 hectares in total being grown of willow and miscanthus in the UK at the moment. So this is a really big upscaling that the Committee for Climate Change are advising. So I talked about this kind of moving feast of policy, but I wanted to flag up that the biomass strategy is being revisited, and there's a consultation and a call for evidence out at the moment. This ends on the 15th of June, so it's live right now. And if you're interested in this area, I'm sure that government would be really appreciative of your input to these questions. They really value farmers and land managers feeding into this. So there are 4 main chapters within this consultation, looking at the supply of biomass, the end uses of biomass, sustainability and accounting methods for emissions, and also new innovations. And this will help form the policy that I think everyone needs to make those real kind of big decisions on these long-term crops. Having said that, if self-supply is still being considered, that secures your own feedstock, so it's kind of independent. But the reason behind this is there's this acknowledgement that bioenergy crops are good, but because there's only a limited amount of land, this consultation is really considering where they can be best deployed to get maximum impact, and to reduce risks around deploying them and get maximum impact for delivering net zero. So that's the whole aim of this consultation. Policy. Let's think about some practicalities. So whilst you might see these crops, they look really big and robust, both SRC willow and miscanthus actually need some real attention to detail in the establishment phase. This is a picture of the twin row design of a SRC willow plantation about 2 or 3 weeks after planting, and you can see that it's a good weed-free site there. And these crops need to be maintained as weed-free really early on, because they're not actually that competitive to weeds, and their only real strategy about being competitive is gaining canopy closure and shading them out. So to make them a success, don't just bang them in. You need to prepare the land properly, and a lot of this is done in the pre-planting period. But once they are established, they self-shade, and this is a 3-year-old crop of willow that's very clean in the bottom and doing really well. But you can't assume that all crops will get like this. It needs real attention to detail early on, and I can't emphasise this enough. Once you get this right in the establishment phase, though, they need very little inputs or management for the subsequent 30 years. So it's really important to get this right early on. So let's compare the 3 main options: miscanthus, short rotation coppice willow, or short rotation forestry. So there's different time lengths here. Miscanthus is harvested annually. Willows are normally harvested every 3 years, but it's a kind of 2 to 4 year range depending on your site. And short rotation forestry is a longer cycle from 8 to 12 years. So they're all quicker than conventional forestry. And you can see that there's different options, a kind of short, medium and longer term perennial energy crop. And of course the heights kind of vary as well. Of course miscanthus is just 1 year old biomass when it's harvested, so it's about 3 meters tall. Short rotation coppice willow is about 7 meters tall when it's harvested, and the short rotation forestry trees are of course taller. And it's a similar kind of trend with stocking density. That's how many plants per hectare are planted, so 20,000 for miscanthus, 15,000 plants per hectare for SRC willow, and around 1,500 for short rotation forestry. The establishment costs are all kind of similar ballparks. This is your biggest cost when establishing these, and that's why I emphasise that it's so important to get it right, because you don't want to have to pay for these twice. You're making a real investment in these crops up front, and it's important to get them right and get them away and get them growing. Your second biggest cost, of course, is harvesting, but that comes later. The yields are listed there. Miscanthus is a very dry crop when it's harvested. It's it dries and it's harvested in the spring, and at 16% moisture content, you achieve 9 to 15 tonnes per hectare. I've listed the willow and the short rotation forestry products here as dry tonnes, but of course they are wet when they're harvested. It's about 50% moisture content when they're harvested. The short rotation forestry crops can be seasoned, so they kind of dry down naturally, but the willow chip, especially if you harvest and you go for the direct cut and chip, you need to think about drying this and storage and so on, because your end use probably needs it around 25% moisture content. So whether that's in a building or stacked up outside, it just does need a bit of consideration. And I've listed the kilowatt hours, the price per kilowatt hour, if you self-supply. So if you are buying in wood chip or other biomass, if you have got biomass boilers, this is a kind of typical price per kilowatt hour if you self-supply. There are some alternative markets and uses for these crops as well. So if you buy in straw a lot for livestock, miscanthus has been used for this purpose. So it can be a fuel, but it also can be used for bedding. Willow has been used in New Zealand quite commonly as a forage source in the summer. There's some research going on which is showing that the condensed tannins and some other compounds in willows can be good for animal health as well. So it's not just food, it could have health benefits. It could have poultry or kind of livestock incorporated in it if it's planted in certain ways, and it could also be deployed as a buffer strip or to reduce kind of runoff or even biofiltration beds. Short rotation forestry as well, you're producing kind of bigger diameter stems there or trunks, so it can be used in firewood or construction potentially as well if the quality's right. So different crops, and it's horses for courses really. They're all great, but you need to think about your system and what will fit in best within that. So miscanthus is actually a tropical C4 photosynthesis pathway energy grass that comes from Southeast Asia. It's either planted by rhizomes or by kind of plug plants that are transplanted. It's harvested annually, and you do need to think about your boiler specification. Sometimes they're set up more for wood than miscanthus, so you've got slightly higher ash and some minerals in miscanthus when it's burnt. So you do need to check out your boiler spec if you're looking to self-supply to check that that's right. So typically a species mixture of around 6 different varieties are grown. Willow's really good for biodiversity, and it's good when deployed at wet sites as well. Willows are kind of riparian in their nature, and they do very well at wetter sites. You do need to think that willows need specialist machinery to plant and also to harvest it, whereas miscanthus, that I mentioned earlier, that can tend to be done with standard on-farm machinery. So you do need to think about which contractor you're going to use for this, where they're located, any kind of costs associated with bringing that specialist machinery to you, as well as their kind of hourly rate. So that's something to think about with SRC willow. I'm guilty of talking more about SRC willow because this is more my research area, but here are some pictures of the step planter. This machine cuts these long rods, 2-meter rods, into 20-centimeter cuttings and plants them in the twin row design. So that's how they're planted, and there are actually 3 different types of harvesting techniques. This is class Jaguar, but different brands of forage harvester can be used, and this is the direct cut and trip. You can see the machinery and the trailers straddling these twin double rows, so that's where they're planted in this configuration. But there's also whole stem harvesters, which can actually help the crop season, but incur a kind of and dry, but incur a double handling cost because you need to handle them a couple of times. And there's also a billet harvester, which is a kind of intermediate where it's a kind of 30 centimeter, 40 centimeter lengths, which again allows them to dry more naturally, but does need some double handling. So it just illustrates, even if you choose a crop, there's different harvesting techniques, but you need to know about what your specification is for your end use, and then you can kind of configure your harvesting to suit that. And I wanted to quickly talk about the short rotation coppice willow coppice cycle. So there is an establishment year, so it's actually 4 years to your first harvest, because after this establishment year, after you've planted the 20 centimeter cuttings, growth from them is quite small and single stemmed because the crop's just establishing. But when this is cut back at the end of the establishment year, it stimulates multi-stem growth, and you start to get that really vigorous growth and that economic yield. And then after that establishment year, you're into your 3-year cycles. So it's worth bearing in mind that whilst we talk about 3-year cycles in SRC willow, it's actually 4 years until your first harvest because of this establishment year. And the final kind of longer cycle option is short rotation forestry, and there's a real choice here for different tree species. Could be ash, eucalyptus, southern beech, poplar, sycamore. So again, think about what will work best with you and seek specialist advice. Now these could work really well in silvopastoral agroforestry systems as well, that could integrate your livestock farming along with tree growth. The other crops could do as well, but they'd have to grow in kind of more deliberate strips. So yeah, this is a great option as well if you want longer term options. So I tried to pull together some suppliers, some experts, some contractors here who you could look up and potentially use depending on which way you want to go. So it's worth putting your homework, like I said, in this area, and some of these crops you do need to use specialists because they've got specialist kit, but there's lots of good companies and good advice out there. And apologies if I haven't included anyone, but these are people that I'm aware of, and some of the current best practice guidelines as well. Yeah, and I really look forward to the discussions next week, and really look forward to your thoughts, and especially around barriers to entry, what would work with your farm systems, and yeah, really looking forward to discussions then, and look forward to meeting you. Thanks very much. Bye.